Welcome to the Castlevania Timeline, Part 3, Passing the Torch. In Part 2, we saw a world in which Dracula returned from the dead, and the Belmont clan was forced to stand against the Dark Lord time and time again, ending with his son Alucard destroying his own father, and the Belmont clan no longer able to touch the vampire killer, the only weapon that Dracula truly feared. A couple of years after Alucard had defeated Dracula, the world fully expected the vampire's return, but the Belmont clan had disappeared, leaving the people of Europe defenseless. Many organizations were created at the time to research ways to destroy Dracula without having to rely on the Belmont clan or the vampire killer, and only one was successful. A man called Barlow created an order called Ecclesia, which used magical glyphs to stand against the forces of darkness. Barlow began experimenting with a magical power he discovered called Dominus, that had the potential to be used against Dracula. He searched the land looking for someone that had the potential to use it, and monsters began appearing, signaling Dracula's return. The monsters attacked several villages, and Barlow looked through the ruins for survivors. Eventually, he came across an orphan girl named Shanoa, and brought her into the order. Around the same time, he also found a young boy named Albus, who he also gave a home to in Ecclesia, and trained both children to use magical glyphs. Albus and Shanoa became extremely close, and considered themselves brother and sister. Over time, they mastered their powers, but Shanoa was exceptionally skilled, and she was chosen by the Order to use the powers of the Dominus. This leads us to the year 1810, and the events of Castlevania Order of Ecclesia. The Order had planned a ritual that would allow Shanoa to absorb Dominus into her own abilities. But Albus interrupted the ceremony, taking Dominus for himself. Shanoa collapsed and blacked out. After waking up, Shanoa discovered that her memories were gone, and Barlow told her what had happened. Albus had escaped with Dominus and left them without the power to fight Dracula. Barlow labeled Albus a traitor and ordered Shanoa to go after him and retrieve Dominus from him. While searching for Albus, Shanoa came upon an abandoned village, Weigel Village, the same one Simon had traveled through during the events of Castlevania II: Simon's Quest. And in the village, she discovered that Albus had passed through and taken the inhabitants one by one to different locations. She promised that she would rescue everybody and set off to find out what Albus had done with the villagers. Shanoa successfully tracked down each villager and learned that Albus had been performing experiments on them and taking samples of their blood. Shanoa tracked down Albus, struggling to control the power of Dominus, and in an effort to learn how she was able to absorb its power and control it, he gifted her one of its 3 pieces, then escaped, and Shanoa followed his trail.
Go to hell.
After finding Albus a second time, he gave Shanoa another piece of the Dominus and escaped once again to continue his mysterious experiments. Finding him for the final time, Shanoa confronted an Albus completely taken over by the power of the 3rd Dominus piece, and she was forced to fight her adoptive brother.
Vertical shot! Flip and bullet! Dodge this!
Shanoa had no choice but to kill him, and she absorbed the 3rd and final Dominus piece, absorbing the memories of Albus and revealing the secrets behind the power of Dominus. Albus didn't actually steal Dominus for his own greed. He stole it to protect her. Using the complete power of the Dominus would have killed its user, and Barlow kept the secret from Shanoa, but Albus found out. After Shinoa realized the truth, Albus's spirit appeared to her, now absorbed within the Dominus, and he revealed the villagers he had kidnapped were direct descendants of the Belmont bloodline, who had vanished years before. He had hoped that experimenting with their blood would have revealed a way to control the power of Dominus without it taking over him, but the experiments were fruitless, and Albus begged Shinoa never to use Dominus, and revealed that the power of Dominus was extracted from the remains of Dracula that Juste Belmont had dealt with years before. Understanding the danger of using Dracula's remains, Shinoa rushed back to Ecclesia to confront Barlow with the truth, and she would discover a shocking secret. Barlow told Shinoa that she needed to use the power of Dominus immediately to stop Dracula from returning, and remembering the promise she made to Albus to never use its powers, she refused. Shinoa confronted Barlow with his lies, and he angrily threatened to absorb Dominus from her dead body and attacked her.
Who's still? Please! Inexperienced amateur! Die, Shanoa! How dare you! Even forgetting who raised you! You! Stupid disciple! Why you?
After critically wounding Barlow, Shinoa questioned him as to why he wanted to use the Dominus so badly, and he revealed the Order of Ecclesia's darkest secret. The headquarters of the Order were built over the ruins of Dracula's castle, and the Order was established to resurrect Dracula, not to find a way of stopping his return. Barlow wanted to use the power of Dominus to destroy the seal that was keeping Dracula from returning. Seeing that his plan had failed, Barlow decided to sacrifice his own life to allow Dracula's return.
Oh, Dracula!
Dracula's castle had risen due to Barlow's sacrifice. Determined to fulfill her mission, and the only person on Earth equipped to face Dracula, Shinoa raced to his castle. And in a tower near Dracula's throne room, Death appeared, having been freshly returned to the world of the living. After defeating Death, Shinoa reached Dracula's chambers and saw the Dark Lord sitting before her. Knowing there was no Belmont to stand against him, she boldly threatened Dracula, and the Vampire King unleashed his powers on her. Dracula's powers were too great, and out of desperation, Shinoa unlocked the power of Dominus she had promised not to use, turning Dracula's own dark powers against him.
Now is the time of your demise.
Shinoa collapsed, knowing the Dominus required a sacrifice. But Albus's spirit appeared again, and he took her place as the sacrifice. Shinoa escaped from Dracula's castle watching it crumble, then left to find her place in the world, closing off the events of Castlevania, Order of Ecclesia. Shinoa's defeat of Dracula inspired groups of vampire hunters, not to depend on the Belmont clan any longer. One group, led by vampire hunter Maurice Baldwin, created a whip known as the Hunter Whip. using similar magic that created the Vampire Killer. Though the Hunter Whip was nowhere near as powerful as the Vampire Killer and could not destroy a vampire as powerful as Dracula, it could still seal him away. And 10 years after Shanoa defeated Dracula, Morris was forced to take action. Dracula had risen once again, and together with his two closest friends, he faced him with the Hunter Whip, successfully sealing him away. But to his horror, his friends had been killed in the battle, and he took it upon himself to raise their young son, Nathan Graves, alongside his own son, Hugh Baldwin. Morris trained the two boys and eventually chose Nathan to receive the Hunter Whip. Years later, Morris and the two highly trained young men tracked down Carmilla, Dracula's servant previously defeated by Maria during the events of Rondo of Blood, now alive and well. Carmilla, hiding out in an Austrian castle, prepared a ceremony that would break the seal Morris had trapped Dracula in 10 years before. This leads us to the year 1830, and the events of Castlevania Circle of the Moon. Carmilla performed the ritual to break Dracula's seal, and Dracula reappeared as Morris, Nathan, and Hugh entered the castle. He was still weak from the resurrection and needed time to regain his power. And recognizing Morris as the man who had sealed him away, Dracula decided to use the vampire hunter's life force to regain his strength, capturing him and sending Nathan and Hugh plummeting to the bottom of the castle. After reaching the depths of the castle dungeon, Hugh told Nathan to leave the castle and that he would be the one to rescue his father. But Nathan refused and set out to find Morris, who had provided him a home and taught him everything he knew. Eventually, Nathan encountered Carmilla and demanded to know where his master was being held, and attacked the vampire countess. After fighting Carmilla, Nathan also encountered Hugh, now possessed by Dracula. Dracula had sensed the jealousy that Hugh felt, with Nathan being chosen to wield the Hunter Whip over him, and tapped into his dark feelings to take control of the young man. Defeated, Hugh came to his senses and realized that his friend was worthy of the Hunter Whip. Then Hugh left to continue tracking down Dracula and his father. Nathan also continued his search and faced against death. After defeating Death, he tracked down Dracula and found him performing the ritual to absorb Morris's life force, and interrupted it. While Nathan battled Dracula, Hugh was able to save his father and escape the castle, preventing Dracula from gaining his full power, and leaving Nathan to finish sealing away the Dark Lord. Transporting Nathan into the Netherrealm he was sealed away in, Dracula exposed his monstrous form. Nathan defeated Dracula with the Hunter Whip. Though it wasn't enough to destroy him, it was enough to seal him away from the world. Nathan left with Hugh and Morris to continue his vampire training and perfected his skills, closing off the events of Castlevania Circle of the Moon. As the years passed, Dracula's forces searched for a way to release the seal. Death eventually discovered a village filled with a tribe of ancient warriors who were cursed with the ability to turn into werewolves. Death saw this as an opportunity and closely watched a young man named Cornell who lived in the village. The tribe was cursed for generations and constantly struggled to keep their powers in check. One night, the curse overtook the tribe, and they attacked a local village, slaughtering all of its people. Cornell reverted back to his human form and found one survivor, a young girl named Ada. Cornell was racked with guilt over the part he had played, and he took Ada in and raised her as a sister, giving her a pendant that would protect her from the other members of the tribe. Determined to keep Ada safe at all costs, Cornell mastered his wolf transformation and became the only member of the tribe who can turn it on and off willingly, while retaining full control. Death repeatedly contacted Cornell and tried convincing him to use his abilities for Dracula's forces, and Cornell refused. But Death set his eyes on Cornell's childhood friend Ortega instead. Ortega had grown up jealous of Cornell's power, especially when he learned to control it so well. Death promised Ortega more power if he agreed to join Dracula's forces, and Ortega agreed. Death ordered the young man-wolf to burn down the village and take Ada to be sacrificed for Dracula's return. While on a training mission away from home, Cornell sensed something was wrong, and returned to find the village gone, his people destroyed, and the pendant he gave Ada on the ground. Cornell picked up her pendant, and determined to rescue her, followed her scent. This leads us to the year 1844, and the events of Castlevania, Legacy of Darkness. Cornell followed Ada's trail, and took a ship to the shores outside of Dracula's castle, risen again. Upon reaching the castle gates, Cornell found his old friend Ortega, and was relieved that he had survived the attack on their village. But Ortega revealed that he had been the one responsible, and all the villagers were either killed or put under Dracula's control within the castle. Ortega left and looked forward to later confronting Cornell. Cornell explored the castle and discovered that it had appeared near a family's mansion. And inside the mansion, Cornell found Master Oldry, the owner of the mansion, banging on a door. Driven mad by the thirst for blood, Oldry attacked Cornell, revealing that he was a vampire. Inside the bedroom, Cornell found a woman named Mary, who was the wife of Oldry. She told Cornell that her husband had been turned into a vampire by another vampire named Gilderai, who was working with Death inside Dracula's castle. Mary begged Cornell to save her son Henry, who'd been hiding in the garden behind the mansion. Cornell found Henry and led him out of the garden towards the forest, giving him Ada's pendant and letting him know that it would protect him from danger as long as he wore it. Cornell then made his way underground and was attacked by Gilderai, the vampire who had turned Master Oldry and essentially destroyed the nearby family. Gilderai was amazed by Cornell's power, and a witch named Actrice, who had pledged herself to Dracula, appeared and teleported them both away. After reaching the upper floors of the castle, Cornell and Ortega finally faced off, and Ortega wanted nothing more than to prove he was better than Cornell, and Cornell wanted to avenge his tribe, and Ortega unleashed the abilities granted to him by Dracula's power. Accepting his final defeat, Ortega regretted the part he played in the destruction of his village, and told Cornell that Ada hadn't been sacrificed yet, then jumped to his death in shame. Soon after, Cornell reached Dracula's throne room, finding him alive, and holding Ada captive. Dracula taunted Cornell to use his full power and give in to his man-wolf side, and used Ada's energy to transform into his ultimate form, and transported Cornell into a nightmarish dimension. Dracula, defeated, began sinking back into the realm he was banished to, and threatened to take Ada with him. But Cornell finally unleashed his man-wolf powers, separating himself from them. But Dracula's plan had worked perfectly. He never wanted Ada. He simply wanted to coax Cornell into sacrificing his man-wolf powers in order to use them for his full return. And this would soon have dire consequences. Cornell, finally freed from his curse, left with Ada and met with Henry, safely waiting for them in the forest. They all decided to stay together, and Cornell lived the rest of his days as a normal man. And back in Dracula's castle, his minions used the man-wolf's power to truly resurrect the Lord of Darkness, closing off the events of Castlevania: Legacy of Darkness. Soon after, a young boy was born named Malice, who was raised in a small village by loving parents. But this child was secretly Dracula, having used Cornell's powers to be reborn in the body of a child, waiting patiently as his powers grew. One day, death located the boy, and Malice murdered his parents and burned down his village, returning with death to his old castle. News of the burned village spread, and rumors of Dracula's return had the people living in fear once again. Around the same time, a young man named Reinhard Schneider heard the rumors, and decided to fulfill his destiny and take action. Although having a different last name, Reinhardt was a direct descendant of the Belmont clan, and his father was the caretaker of the vampire killer whip. Reinhardt's father had taught him how to be a vampire hunter, but Belmont blood could no longer hold the whip. Determined to redeem his family, Reinhardt searched for a solution, and eventually found a priest that could help. The priest was able to temporarily lift the curse placed on the Belmont bloodline, and for the first time in over half a century, a Belmont held the vampire killer. Reinhardt also met a young girl called Carrie Fernandez, who was skilled in magic and descended directly from the bloodline of Saifa Belmades, the wife of Trevor Belmont. He recruited Carrie to help him find out if the rumors of Dracula's return were true. This leads us to the year 1852 and the events of Castlevania 64. Reinhardt and Carrie fought their way through the same forest that Cornell had passed through in his time, and made their way to Dracula's castle. Eventually, they split up to cover more ground. And Schneider discovered the Oldry mansion where Henry had lived, now abandoned, except for a mysterious woman named Rosa, who took it upon herself to tend to the roses in the garden. Rosa revealed herself to be a vampire, but had no desire to attack Reinhardt, and instead told him how to reach the castle and disappeared. And in the old mansion, he also met a fellow vampire hunter named Charlie Vincent, who was also on a mission to stop Dracula. Reinhardt later found Rosa again attempting suicide by sunlight, and he found himself saving a vampire for the first time in his life. Rosa had never asked to be a vampire, and Reinhardt took pity on her, wishing he can help her. Rosa left, warning Reinhardt to leave the castle, concerned for his safety. But he knew if Dracula was alive, it was his duty to slay him. In the castle, Malice, who was secretly Dracula, followed Reinhardt, pretending to be a boy who was kidnapped and brought to the castle, in an effort to study the vampire hunter up close. Carrie, having explored the castle on her own and making it near the top, encountered the witch Actrice, the witch that had been working with Death to bring back Dracula. Carrie defeated the witch, creating a safe passage for Reinhardt and the vampire killer, and as he made his way through the castle center, he encountered Death, forcing Rosa to fight him. Not wanting to hurt Rosa, Reinhardt held back, and Death disappeared with her. Death knew the Belmont was getting too close, and waited patiently to ambush the young vampire hunter. Death found Reinhardt and in a cowardly ambush attacked him, but Rosa jumped in the way and received the deadly blow. Reinhardt promised Rosa that God would forgive her tortured soul, and vowed to avenge her, and Death, disgusted by Belmont once again wielding the Holy Whip, swore to destroy him. Finally making his way to Dracula's throne room, Reinhardt faced off against the Demon Lord. Using the power of the vampire killer, Reinhardt killed the monster and left as the castle began to crumble. But the nightmare wasn't over yet. Malice appeared and told Reinhardt that he had to destroy Dracula at all. Dracula's vampire servant, Gilderai, was posing as the Dark Lord of the castle, and then Malice shed his false form and revealed himself to be Dracula in disguise, reborn and in a stronger, younger body. Having been wounded by the whip, Dracula reverted back to his child form, attempting to manipulate Reinhardt's compassion. But the vampire hunter Charlie Vincent appeared and could see right through Dracula's illusion. Dousing the vampire in holy water. Filled with rage, Dracula transported Reinhardt into his realm, where he took the form of an enormous demon. Slaying Dracula and redeeming his family name, Reinhardt watched as Dracula's castle fell. And discovered that Rosa had in fact survived, and was cured of her vampirism. Reinhardt and Rosa left together, and Carrie made it back to her home, ending the events of Castlevania 64. A short time later, Reinhardt realized the priest's enchantment wore off. He could no longer touch the whip again, and the curse placed on the Belmont bloodline returned. Throughout the 1800s, Dracula's resurrections were coming much too frequently, and Reinhardt knew the vampire killer had to be used. Even though he could no longer use the whip, he searched the land for somebody that could, and discovered the Morris family. The Morris clan was a distant lineage related to the Belmont clan by blood, but not directly descended from them. They were able to wield the vampire killer, but at a great cost. The whip would slowly drain their life force, resulting in a very early death. But the Morris clan accepted this responsibility, and the vampire hunter was entrusted to them. At some point in the late 1800s, Dracula had returned in a weakened state, leading us to the year 1897 and the events of Bram Stoker's Dracula. The details of the events surrounding this time are shrouded in mystery, but some form of the event was recorded in Bram Stoker's novel. What's known for sure is that the current wielder of the vampire killer, Quincy Morris, a vampire hunter from Texas, was successful in killing Dracula, but also lost his life during the battle. And the vampire killer was passed on to his son, John Morris. Dracula's son Alucard had been working behind the scenes over the last 100 years, helping distant relatives of the Belmont clan to prepare for Dracula's return, and crafted a magical spear he called the Alucard Spear, enchanted with holy power and meant to complement the vampire killer. Alucard gave the spear to a young man named Eric Lecard, related by blood to the Belmonts also, and a close friend of John Morris. The two men trained together under the direction of Alucard and prepared for Dracula's return, and soon they would be needed in a world plunged into bloodshed. The last remaining member of the Bartley clan, who resurrected Dracula during Christopher Belmont's time, was a woman named Elizabeth Bartley, who had allowed herself to become a vampire, and referred to herself as Dracula's niece. Elizabeth dreamed of resurrecting her lord, and devised a plot to use the darkness of humanity itself to plunge the world into despair and feed Dracula's power. In June 1914, Elizabeth secretly murdered Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, knowing it would spark all-out war. The First World War had begun and had spread across Europe, exactly as Elizabeth Bartley had expected. Humans were killing each other, towns were being destroyed, and suffering was everywhere. Elizabeth used all of the lost souls in Europe to power Dracula's resurrection, to bring him into a world covered in blood. Hearing of Castlevania rising again, and with the war raging across Europe, John and Eric knew it was time to act, and traveled to Europe together to track down Elizabeth and stop her, leading us to the year 1917 and the events of Castlevania Bloodlines. John and Eric made their way through the ruins of Dracula's castle, expecting to find the vampire resurrected and waiting. But after traveling through the castle, they found no trace of Dracula. Elizabeth had purposely led the two hunters there in order to buy time for Dracula's resurrection to occur. The vampire countess traveled through Europe, unleashing Dracula's forces and causing as much chaos and destruction as possible, while World War I raged on. The two men followed her trail, freeing the various countries from the wrath of Dracula's hordes. John and Eric traveled to Greece, where the monsters had taken over ancient ruins, and a wizard was causing massive flooding in the nearby city. And a stone golem stood as the final creature infecting the region. In Italy, demons had slaughtered much of the population, and a demonic gargoyle issued orders from the top of the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And while traveling in Germany, John and Eric discovered a munitions factory run by undead soldiers Elizabeth had reanimated and controlled. She made sure the factory continued operating, shipping weapons to the battlefield, ensuring that World War I would continue. And the two men knew they had to shut it down. In France, the Royal Palace of Versailles was a hotbed of creatures that were spreading throughout the city. After freeing the areas that Elizabeth Bartley had rampaged through, John and Eric tracked her down to her home in England, a castle called Castle Proserpina. The only obstacles left in their way were Death and Elizabeth, still attempting to resurrect Dracula. Death resurrected several of Dracula's generals in an effort to tire the vampire hunters, and Death felt the power of the vampire killer once again. Elizabeth, knowing she had no chance, attacked them anyways, and John would make sure she paid for all the lives lost because of her plans. But it was too late. All the suffering caused by the war had allowed Dracula to return, and without the true Belmont clan able to help, John Morris knew if he failed, it would be the end of mankind. John, equipped with the vampire killer, and Eric, equipped with the Alucard spear, destroyed Dracula and watched Castlevania fall. Soon after, World War I ended, and the world slowly rebuilt. John eventually married, and he had a son named Jonathan Morris, who would be the last man not directly descended from the Belmonts to carry the whip. Sadly, a couple of years later, the cost of carrying the vampire killer for so long took its toll on John, and he died, while Jonathan was still a young boy. In 1923, Eric Lecard had two daughters of his own, Stella and Loretta, who would inherit his magical gifts, and taught them how to help Jonathan unlock the power of the vampire killer, should it be needed. But before John's death, John made Eric promise to never teach Jonathan how to use the whip. He knew the cost of using it and refused to allow his son to share his fate. And years later, war would once again ravage the world. In Germany, Adolf Hitler had risen to power, and countries across the world were at war again, costing millions of lives. And just how Elizabeth had done during World War I, a vampire named Bronner used the suffering of the lost souls killed in the world to resurrect Dracula's castle. Bronner captured an older Eric Lecard as bait for his two daughters, who reminded him of his own daughters killed during the First World War. Stella and Loretta rushed to the castle to save their father and found him badly wounded. Bronner attacked the girls and turned them into vampires, casting a spell to force them to love him as their father, then killed Eric right before their eyes. But Eric's will was so strong that his spirit did not move on, and he hid inside the castle, waiting for someone who can help his daughters. Jonathan knew Dracula's castle had risen, and against his father's wishes, he grabbed the vampire killer. Angry with his father for not teaching him how to use the whip, but determined to learn, Jonathan asked his childhood friend, a young witch named Charlotte Owlin, to help him, and together they traveled to the castle. This takes us to the year 1944 and the events of Castlevania: Portrait of Ruin. Jonathan and Charlotte reached Dracula's castle and explored its insides, while trying to find Dracula, thinking he was responsible for the castle rising again. Eventually, they encountered the spirit of Eric, posing as a ghost who called himself Wind. Wind offered to share his knowledge of the castle with Jonathan and Charlotte, but since Wind was secretly Eric Lecard, he knew exactly how to unlock the power of the vampire killer and acted like a mentor to the child of his old friend throughout his journey, teaching him how to rely on his own power instead of relying on the whip. Jonathan and Charlotte discovered a mysterious painting and realized that's how Bronner was controlling the castle's power and spreading the minions of the castle around the world. Bronner not only was a vampire but was also a painter and used powerful magic to open portals through the paintings. Charlotte knew if they entered each painting and destroyed the darkness within, Bronner's connection to the castle would be severed and his powers would weaken. Jonathan and Charlotte entered the portal and found themselves in a city overtaken by monsters, eventually coming face to face with the headless Dullahan. They entered another painting, taking them to a pyramid full of monsters, where an ancient Egyptian queen called Astarte reigns supreme. After returning to the castle, Jonathan and Charlotte found Loretta, one of Eric's daughters, now a vampire, and she confirmed that they had in fact slightly weakened Bronner's power. After they discovered the second portrait, Jonathan and Charlotte met Bronner, who denied that he was trying to revive Dracula. Since Dracula had been revived and defeated so many times before, Bronner felt he would be a better successor to the castle and Dracula's mission to terrorize mankind. Eventually, the pair encountered Death, letting them know that he had no connection to Bronner and taunting Jonathan for not being able to use the vampire killer. But even though Death had no allegiance to Bronner, Jonathan and Charlotte knew he had plans of his own and challenged him. Surprised by Jonathan's abilities, Death escaped. After exploring more of the castle, the pair faced against Stella, one of Eric's daughters.
Please observe! Press it
After being defeated, Stella dropped a pendant, which revealed who they were and who their father was. Confronting Wind with this new information, he finally revealed that he was really Eric Lecard, and he asked the pair to please help his daughters and restore them to their former selves. Jonathan and Charlotte continued their quest through the painting, searching for a way to help the two sisters. They traveled through multiple dimensions, including a deranged circus near a devastated town, and fought the demonic creature known as Legion, a murky swamp hiding an abandoned sorcery academy and filled with man-eating plants and frogs, and home to the monstrous Dagon, a world where it's eternally reigning and an immortal monster serves as its most powerful weapon. Encountering Stella and Loretta again, Jonathan and Charlotte were determined to help them. During their travels, Charlotte had learned a powerful spell known as the Sanctuary spell that could cure them of the vampire curse. After the battle, the sisters were themselves once again, and revealed to Jonathan that they can awaken the power of the vampire killer, so he would be able to use it. But to be able to wield the whip, Jonathan had to pass a test. Richter Belmont was the last Belmont to wield the whip before the curse infected the bloodline. For Jonathan to wield it, the whip required him to defeat the memory of Richter that it held inside. The young vampire hunter succeeded, and the vampire killer, fully awakened, accepted Jonathan as its new master. With the whip in hand, the pair tracked down Bronner and faced him in combat, fully prepared. The Vampire Lord, knowing he was defeated, submitted to Jonathan and Charlotte, and Death appeared. With Bronner dead and the castle still standing, Death saw this as an opportunity to resurrect Dracula. With Dracula returned to the world of the living, Jonathan and Charlotte rushed to the throne room and faced odds that no previous hero had ever faced before them. Death and Dracula stood together against this new hero wielding the vampire killer. Death was severely wounded by the power of the whip and offered his soul to Dracula. Absorbing Death, Dracula took his ultimate form. With little training and relying on his own power, Jonathan Morris had destroyed Dracula and Castlevania fell. Eric's spirit was no longer bound to the castle, and he was able to give his daughters one final goodbye before moving on, closing the events of Castlevania: Portrait of Ruin. After his victory, Jonathan grew to be a wise warrior, and he used the vampire killer for years with no negative effects. To his surprise, the combination of having defeated the memory of Richter Belmont and his defeat of Dracula by relying on his own strength permanently lifted the curse of the Belmont bloodline, and the whip chose to spare his life force. With Dracula gone and the vampire killer fully awakened, Jonathan knew what he had to do next. He made it his life mission to track down the Belmont clan and return the whip to its original owners. Join me next time for the Castlevania Timeline Part 4, The End of Dracula, where we'll witness the return of the Belmont clan and the final confrontation between the Prince of Darkness and humanity.